Today we're dropping in from the skies, teleporting into battle, or tunneling up from beneath, as we're going over deep striking tactics in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're going to be doing a bit of an overview of reserves in Warhammer 40k. I know it's not technically called deep striking anymore in the game, but it'll always be that in my head, even if the days of rolling a scatter dice and having your squad go wildly off target are long gone. In the video we'll talk about the positives and negatives of putting things in reserve, when and where you should think about trying to drop, and talking about charging out of deep strike as its own topic. Plenty to talk through, so let's jump straight into it, and if you spot anything that I missed then feel free to let us know down in the comments. So let's talk about the basics of putting units in reserve then. In general there are two big advantages to putting things in reserve. It basically allows you to get an optimal turn of damage dealing off, so it can be quite good for more fragile units that you might risk losing if you started on the board. Sometimes it could potentially be worth it literally just to keep that unit off the table, so your opponent has no chance of dealing with them whatsoever, and they're guaranteed to be able to do some damage. The other big advantage is of course that they get to position wherever they want to on the map, so it can be pretty handy for getting in table quarters, taking objectives, or either reinforcing a flank that your opponent's threatening to overrun, or just really trying to overrun your opponent in one area of the board. For that reason it can be quite good on slow units as well, things that might struggle to reach exactly where they need to be. There are downsides though. Firstly, you'll get no damage output out of them till turn 2 or turn 3, which means that you're not going to be getting a particularly early advantage over your opponent. And if you do put a few too many things in deep strike, it means for the first turn or so, you might have a big numerical disadvantage on the table. Sometimes deep striking can cost command points, particularly if you're using strategic reserves to outflank around the enemy. And sometimes you can have some very limited options for where you drop if you're against an army that's screening well. Sometimes you might be able to drop nowhere near the opponent's deployment zone, or even be forced to drop back in your own deployment zone against some hordes. For the vast majority of units in 9th edition, they can usually drop anywhere on the table that's greater than 9 inches away from the enemy, and any units that have the power to go even closer than that are very powerful indeed. Grey Knights and Genestealer Cult can pull off some of those tricks. In 9th edition I think Deep Strike is fairly similarly powerful to 8th. The board sizes are a bit smaller, so it's a bit easier to screen out for your opponent, but I think we do tend to run into more elite armies in 9th than in 8th, that still might really struggle to cover the entire ground. So bearing in mind all that, you might have certain units that you're pretty sure are going to deep strike in your army, but I would bear in mind there's always the opportunity to not deep strike them if the matchup dictates it. You have to make the decision before you put any units down on the board, so you can't decide halfway through. So you'd base your decision based on your opponent's list and the terrain on the board. As I mentioned a second ago, some armies are just going to take over the entire board, so it might be kind of pointless trying to deep strike for any sort of positioning advantage. Things like hordes, particularly things like Horde Guard, who have multiple small units to cover everywhere, might zone you out of the entire half of the board. Again, certain melee armies might well be just guaranteed to be rushing towards you anyway, so it might make sense to have your units on the board to deal out a bit of range damage and maybe countercharge, rather than having to risk a longer deep strike charge if you are pretty sure that your opponent's units are coming to you. I'd also take the terrain into account as well. Say if you did have some Space Marine Inceptors that could be jumping about, if you thought there was adequate terrain to hide them in your deployment zone and maybe cover them as they jumped up the board, it might be kind of pointless to deep strike them, as you might be able to get damage output from turn 1 and keep them 100% safe until you do so. So when deciding when to drop your deep strike units in, I think for the most part, all things being equal, it's usually best to drop your units as soon as you can, provided you've got a decent target. Warhammer 40k is all about getting big swings of advantage over your opponent, and the sooner you do so the better. If you can kill an enemy unit turn 2 rather than turn 3, then that's a really good thing, because it means that their unit won't have another turn to do damage to your army. It makes anything that can do sort of deep strike moves on turn 1, such as the Dark Matter Crystal or the Orc powered Dad Jump. Those are both really powerful options, as it means that you could be threatening your opponent right from turn 1, maybe even penning them in inside their deployment zone while you steal all the objectives. So under normal circumstances, dropping as soon as possible is usually better. You just need to weigh that up as to whether or not you're going to have a better option for a better target the next turn, and it's kind of hard to predict. You have to think about how well your unit's going to kill the units that they're engaging right now. You might have more options in terms of positioning in later turns, such as more table edges from strategic reserves, and it's often helpful to have at least one unit that you can finally position for the killing blow in turn 3 to make a really big impact on the game, just so your opponent still has to worry about deep strikers in the skies and where they're positioning their units. Typically, if I had say 3 or 4 units in reserve, I'd usually aim to drop 2 or 3 of them on turn 2 and maybe keep 1 or 2 in reserve till turn 3. obviously depending on the opportunities for dropping and how the battle was going. Now, besides deciding when to drop, the main question of deep striking is where to drop, and I do often find myself lingering over these decisions as they can be very important for the best of the game. At first, try and identify the ideal drop sites. You can think about marking out a few potential drop zones with dice 9 inches away from the enemy models to see what your options are, and then think about how each of your units might do best in one place or the other. First and foremost, you're usually going to be wanting your units to be in a good place to deal damage, either from range or from a charge, so naturally good line of sight on what you're wanting to shoot. And if you are charging, I often quite like to keep my options open and have 2 different enemy units within 9 inches of the models so they can pick and choose as to what's best in the charge phase after your shooting has taken effect. Sometimes it might even be worth putting your more ranged units within 9-inch range to attempt a deep strike charge, as you might annoy your opponent's army more than you do yourself by tying up some of their big guns for next turn. I've been playing Raven Guard a little bit recently and deep striking some Eradicators, and I must admit they've done a surprising amount of work in close combat. Other than damage dealing opportunities, ideally you want the unit to be in cover if you can. Light cover can be handy for surviving the enemy retribution, but you could even think about dropping behind line of sight blocking terrain if you are thinking about charging, as that could deny your opponent overwatch if it's going to be a big factor. If it's convenient as well, you could also think about dropping into character auras if you just want the absolute maximum amount of damage. And you can give a thought as well to the objectives, both the primaries, trying to drop on a primary objective or charge something that's already on there, or secondary objectives such as line breaker, engage on all fronts, or deploying scramblers, all can be pretty easily achieved with deep strike units. In terms of things to look out for, I try and be aware if the opponent has any intercept type stratagems, things like Space Marines with their Auspex scan, being able to blast away as a unit within 12 inches. Craftworld Eldar have one that their Farseer can lay down, and if the Farseer is standing next to some Dark Reapers or something, you could potentially lose one of your units from the other side of the map. Admech have their Info Slave Skull, Alpha Legion have an option, and there's quite a lot just spread out through the various different codexes. If it's unavoidable and you have tons of deep strikers, you could potentially try and bait it out by putting a chaff unit down to see if they'll go for that one rather than saving their guns for your bigger threats. I'd also look out for any terrain with -2-inch to charges, things like woods or craters. They could make a deep strike charge almost impossible to succeed if your opponents hold up in them, and if your unit does achieve their objective and kills what they go for, I'd think about how isolated they're going to be after the drop. It might be best not to drop a really slow moving unit right on the edge of the battlefield, just in case they can't do anything for the next turn or two after that. Finally, I thought I'd just quickly mention charges out of deep strike. We already said about line of sight blocking terrain being able to shield overwatch and the cover penalties to charging being one to avoid. I would also add to be kind of careful with your shooting at enemy infantry units, just in case they remove 1 or 2 models from the unit and make your charge a lot longer. And when you are making charges out of deep strike, I'd bear in mind the chances of success and budget a command reroll if the charge is pretty vital to go off. A 9-inch charge has a 28% chance of success, or with a reroll it's 48%. If you can get a +1 to charge, then an 8-inch is 42% or 66% chance with a command reroll budgeted. And if you have +2 to charge, such as dropping into the aura of a Space Marine Chaplain, then things get much better with 58% or 83% with that reroll. Sometimes you might be able to get a gamey slightly shorter charge by if your opponent is set up in the middle floor of a ruin. It actually means that you can drop 9 inches away and have an 8-inch charge on them due to the fact that engagement range has got a vertical height of 5 inches, and it means that you only need to move a slightly shorter than 9-inch distance across the floor to get to them. After making contact with them, all the normal things for charging enemies apply. Consider their position after the charge if you can be on objectives or in cover. Use pile-in and consolidate to your maximum advantage, and thinking about wrapping and trapping enemy units after you've done so. So I hope a few bits have been helpful from that, and I wish your drop troops the best of luck in their next games. For me, I really quite like Deep Strike as a mechanic, and often tend to build it into my lists. They're just a pretty reliable way to get a big swing of damage output against the enemy, and cause a bit of carnage on some unexpected front. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll certainly be keeping the 40k strategy videos coming, with new content out every day. Finally, if you have been watching the videos on the channel quite a lot, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which is how I can afford to spend the time to make quite so many of these. If you did feel like keeping the videos coming, there are a few rewards for being a Patreon. You get to see certain videos early each week, there's regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and you get automatically entered into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway with a chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.